deux conférences, d'abord celle de James O'Shea et ensuite celle de Robert Brandom. Alors nous ferons une interruption après la conférence de James O'Shea. Après, nous entendrons en conclusion de cette première journée Robert Brandom. Alors pour le moment, je vais donc donner la parole à James O'Shea qui vient de University College de Dublin et qui va traiter la question suivante: The Central Importance of Sellars' Theory of Conceptual Change. L'importance centrale de la théorie du changement conceptuel de Sellars. Vous avez la parole.
Thank you very much. You could have been saying anything there for all I know, but I'm sure it was very complimentary. And I do want to thank the organizers for inviting me to give this talk. Actually, the last two papers have shown some of the importance of Sellars on conceptual change, probably better than I will. But it's nice that it came up in both those papers. And here, mostly what I'm doing is I think Sellars' kind of conceptual change is very difficult in science and metaphysics, so I want to try to simplify it without oversimplifying, and then I apply it to a puzzle that Bill DeVries raises, a difficulty in Sellars. And then I try to say a few things about John McDowell's Mind and World, but it's always difficult to say things about, I find it difficult to say anything crisp about Mind and World. Okay. Well, much of recent discussion of Sellars' philosophy has focused quite rightly on the rejection of the myth of the given and the idea of knowledge as a normative standing in the logical space of reasons. And what I want to focus on here is Sellars' account of conceptual change, and in particular how it bears on topics like that are not restricted to scientific theory change. So I'll begin by trying to clarify what his account of conceptual change is by talking about some scientific examples, as Sellars does. But then I want to try to show how that account is important for addressing a couple of issues. And one of them is how to understand the relationship between the manifest image of sophisticated common sense and the scientific image of the world. Just trying to understand what Sellars' view is of the relationship between those. And then try to say some things that bother me about an amazing book, John McDowell's Mind and World, but something I have trouble coming to grips with about it. Okay. So, section 1 on conceptual roles, functional similarity, and abstract entities. Sellars, as we know, defended a view of meaning as functional classification. That's the title of one of his best articles. And the original appearance of that in Synthèse is very interesting because it's during a discussion with Kripke and Putnam, 1974. Davidson, a gang of unbelievable philosophers when he first presented that. But Sellars' view of meaning is that it's a kind of functional classification, and the quickest way into it, as we've seen with Ode's paper, is through 1 through 3, the language entry, inference, and exit rules. So 1, language entry transitions. The speaker responds ceteris paribus to objects in perceptual situations and to certain states of himself with appropriate linguistic activity. Everyone has a handout, I assume, because I'll be working through that. Right, okay. So, for example, she reliably responds to the presence of red objects by uttering, "This is red." 2, intralinguistic transitions. The speaker's linguistic conceptual episodes tend to occur in patterns of valid inference, theoretical and practical, and tend not to occur in patterns which violate logical principles. For example, the material inference from X is red to X is colored. And 3, language exit transitions. For example, the speaker responds ceteris paribus to such linguistic conceptual episodes as "I shall now lift the red one" by lifting the red one. Now, the behavioral transitions or causal roles, the causal patterns in 1, 2, and 3, correspond to the normative ought-to-be rules of pattern-governed linguistic behavior for Sellars. Relative to a given social linguistic practice, rules 1 to 3 describe the norm-generated and norm-governed causal transitions that either take place or ought to take place in linguistic behavior. Such transitions also characterize the corresponding inner conceptual patterns on Sellars' famous view of thought as mental ease and so on. Our inner perceivings, inferrings, and intendings. So for Sellars, these semantic ought-to-be rules in 1, 2, and 3, which generate and govern the causal patterns in 1 to 3, are roughly speaking supposed to provide the general identity criteria for handling questions concerning meaning and conceptual content. So what does red mean? Well, you look to the roles specified in 1 through 3, and it's because tokenings involving red are caught up in those kind of patterns that red means what it does. So whatever formal sophistications we might introduce into our semantics on Sellars' view, we must ultimately handle questions of sameness of meaning by relying on context-relative and purpose-relative assessments of likeness or similarity of meaning for Sellars is what's basic. And given 1 to 3, these will be assessments of relative similarity of functional role within a given context and for a given purpose. And of course, there can be skeptical objections raised about these sort of things, but I mean, if you're watching cricket and you don't know anything about it, like I don't, it still seems that there's a sensible judgment to be made that the bowler is more like a pitcher in baseball than the other positions in cricket. Okay. So there are reasonable judgments of functional role similarity, Sellars thinks, relative to a context and for a given purpose. So using Sellars' dot quoting convention for classifying norm-governed conceptual roles, we can judge, for instance, number 4 on the handout, Rots in German are dot quote reds. And that's saying that the functional role played by Rots within German linguistic practice is relevantly similar for a given purpose of classification to the role of reds within our linguistic framework. We're assuming that to be English for present purposes. Okay. Right. Now, if we take that analysis of meaning in terms of functional role and in terms of context-relative and purpose-relative assessments of similarity of functional role, then that's what takes center stage in Sellars' analysis of conceptual change. But first, I do need to briefly note Sellars' theory of abstract entities. Because actually Sellars thinks one of the big important fruits of his theory of abstract entities is the use that he can make of it in analyzing conceptual change, and we'll see that in a minute. So roughly put, Sellars suggests that the function in natural languages of such abstract singular terms as redness or triangularity is not to name abstract objects of a Platonic kind, but rather to serve as a kind of metalinguistic device for picking out conceptual linguistic roles. So he appeals to the role of what he calls distributive singular terms, as for example in pawn in sentence 5 on the handout, the pawn captures diagonally, as being roughly equivalent, assuming the relevant background normative practices involving pawns in chess, to sentence 6, pawns capture diagonally. So the pawn is a kind of institutional it picks out normal. It's a way of referring to normal functioning pawns that are functioning in a standard manner, where standard is a normative notion. And then, of course, that role can be realized in different materials. So similarly, looking ahead to 7, the singular term triangularity, the abstract singular term triangularity for Sellars, is a metalinguistic device for picking out the dot quote triangular, a conceptual role that's realized in German by, for example, Dreieckig. And so in this way, as Sellars puts it in passage 7, quote, triangularity would be the singular term which stands to the role played by dot quote triangulars, as the pawn stands to the role played by pawns. So he has this nice theory, whether it's true or not, of abstract entities as meta-classifications of conceptual roles, and that, he thinks, then gives you a nice way of talking about changes in concepts, because you can refer to the roles themselves, as it were, by means of these abstract terms. Okay, so while Sellars does believe that there are abstract entities, they turn out to be cultural linguistic products. They have a kind of institutional reality rather than a Platonistic reality. And the primary use of them, he thinks, in this context is that they help us to classify normative linguistic functional roles. And in particular, it helps with now conceptual change in section 2. Okay, so what is Sellars' account of conceptual change? And I'll start with some of the examples that he uses. So, for example, consider Euclidean triangularity as opposed to Riemannian non-Euclidean triangularity. In such cases, Sellars, I think, rightly says that we want to say, on the one hand, the concept of Euclidean triangularity and the concept of Riemannian triangularity are both triangularity concepts. They're both concepts of triangularity. That is, using the Sellars dot quoting device, they're both dot quote triangulars, insofar as they're correctly applicable to certain geometrical figures which are generically similar, as he puts it, in being, for example, three-sided closed figures. So this is a generic classification of the conceptual role that triangulars play within Euclid's geometry and in Riemannian geometry. Yet Euclidean dot quote triangulars and Riemannian dot quote triangulars are also specifically different concepts of triangularity. Insofar as, to put it loosely, the rules for Riemannian triangles entail that triangles have various properties that are impossible for Euclidean triangles. So there's a kind of generic sameness with specific difference account Sellars has of comparison that results from comparing functional roles in different conceptual systems. And that too will be purpose relative and context relative for Sellars. Okay. So what this makes plausible, he thinks, is the idea that in such cases, as we often put it, the concept of triangularity has changed from Euclid to Riemann, while remaining a concept of triangularity. And this is going to allow him to say a lot of different things with that machinery. So using F for predicates, looking ahead to quote 9, and such as triangular, and Fness for abstract singular terms, such as triangularity, Sellars has in effect given us an account of how, as he puts it now in quote number 9, abstract entities, pace pledo, change. A predicate in a certain language may play a role which is generically alike, but specifically different from the role played by F in the base language, and yet be correctly said to stand for Fness, triangularity. To say that the semantical rules governing Fs in our language could change over a period of time, and yet the Fs could all be dot quote Fs, is what is meant by saying Fness has changed over the period. Just as we have the concept of a developing language or conceptual scheme, from which the concept of a language as studied in current formal semantics is an abstraction, so we have the concept of a developing linguistic or conceptual role, from which the usual concept of a sense or intention is also an abstraction. So some of this would be relevant to disputes that I don't have any handy view on. I know John McDowell and Bob Brandom have had exchanges on change in belief versus change in meaning, and is every change in a collateral background assumption, a collateral background of belief held by one person, mean that the meanings have changed? Is every different inferential position a change in view on this view? Well, Sellars thinks the idea of a neat meaning that's preserved is itself an abstraction from a messy picture involving these functional roles that we judge to be more and less similar relative to certain contexts and for certain purposes. Okay. So with this in place, Sellars he's able to offer an account of empirical inquiry in general as characterized by various kinds of critically controlled conceptual change. He thinks of scientific development as a kind of... Mike Williams was talking a lot about the ways that we understand salt or any concept of anything. The laws involving empirical kinds go to define the concepts of those things, but there's a certain kind of open texture that will be allowed by this analysis, so we'll be able to say, within one system, the way mass functions, for instance, in Newton's system, will be relevantly similar in certain respects to the way it functions within Einstein's system. And so we'll be able to say certain things like, they're both concepts of mass, and the concept of mass has changed. Okay, so that's what I want to bring up. And Sellars is particularly keen to emphasize the case of systematically improved explanations that take place in the course of scientific theory replacement, as, for example, in the development from Newtonian mass to Einsteinian mass. And I want to look at that, but I want to try to generalize away from Sellars' scientific realism as well. So on quote number 10, the point stands out most clearly in the case of the evolution of scientific theory. Here it makes obvious sense to say that a certain concept belonging to the theory at one stage is a development of a concept belonging to the theory at an earlier stage. Now, I didn't do this in this paper, but Kevin Sharp has a very nice article, I don't think he's published yet, Sellars' Anti-Descriptivism, where Sharp connects Sellars' view about how a posteriori inquiry feeds into Sellars' view of conceptual framework change. And this gives you a kind of notion, once you have this theory of conceptual change in place, of how a posteriori property re-identification works. That is, of how you can say mass, that property, can be identified across the changes without the sort of doing it exactly the way Putnam and Kripke do. You get within Sellars' system to also say the way in which our predicates are world-involving and how movements across conceptual schemes are getting better and better about the same sorts of magnitudes. So there's a Sellarsian way, which I won't go into in this paper, but I think it's interesting, of accommodating within Sellars' picture some of the things that are done in Kripke and Putnam and that kind of outlook. Okay. Now, it's in relation to these kinds of cases that Sellars develops in Science and Metaphysics a certain framework for saying how meaning, truth, and existence claims can be compared across conceptual frameworks and be rationally compared. And that's what I want to try to simplify right now and then apply it to a puzzle in a minute. Okay. On the basis of that account of conceptual change in terms of specifically different yet generically similar normative functional roles within theories or linguistic frameworks, Sellars develops the notion, Mike referred to it, of a family of propositions that can be compared as to functional similarity across conceptual frameworks. So consider what's hard to keep track of is the perspective from which these judgments are being made. But consider the perspective of our current knowledge of the greater explanatory success of relativity theory in comparison with Newtonian physics, and consider a certain Newtonian proposition P involving the concept of mass. Well, from our Einsteinian perspective, we can say that P is true in a sense with respect to Newtonian theory. That is, if P is a certain proposition about mass as conceived by Newton, it might be warrantedly assertable within Newton's theory. While we also know that there's a certain counterpart proposition P star involving the Einsteinian successor concept of mass, which we know to be part of an explanation of why its counterpart in the Newtonian framework was both approximately true and yet, strictly speaking, false. Say, in relation to velocities that approach the speed of light, we can say that the Newtonian proposition is approximately true, yet strictly speaking, false. So in parallel fashion, according to Sellars, we can do the same thing with existence claims. Does Newtonian mass exist? And so on. Crudely put, in one sense, according to Sellars, we can say that from our Einsteinian perspective, that the masses referred to in the Newtonian proposition P do not exist as they are conceived within Newton's theory. That is, from our perspective, we say that they do not exist as characterized within Newton's theory. mass is invariant with respect to motion in Newton's theory. So from our later perspective, those masses do not exist. But in another sense, on this account, we can make more or less reasonable judgments of functional similarity and hold that the references to Newtonian masses did, in a sense, succeed. Here's the Putnam-Kripke-like aspect. And such masses do exist insofar as they have their functional counterparts in the Einsteinian mass concepts embodied in the successor proposition P star. So if there's enough functional similarity, generic functional similarity, between how mass works within Newton's theory and how mass works within Einstein's theory as both mass concepts, then without a blind causal theory of reference, but rather with an epistemically constrained view about functional role similarity, we can say that they're both relevantly similar, generically similar mass concepts. That is, just as we can make sense of the Newtonian claim that Newtonian physics is approximately true but strictly speaking false, we can also make sense of the two ways in which we're polled about Newtonian masses. In one sense, they don't exist, there are no such things, but in another sense, they do exist, they've survived within Einsteinian theory. So I'm not interested in here defending Sellars' specific view on this, although I think it's interesting. I think it improves upon Kuhn and that it gives a kind of framework for rational comparisons, but it's not my purpose to really go into a full defense of his view on this. Rather, my aim now is to apply this account to a couple of familiar problems in contemporary discussions of Sellars. Okay, section 3, conceptual change and the relationship between the manifest and scientific images. Everybody that works on Sellars at all knows that one of the most difficult issues is the relationship between what is ultimately the relationship between the manifest image of persons and ordinary colored dry goods and the scientific image of an ultimately physical world of colorless subatomic particles and so on. What's the nature of Sellars' synoptic vision where those two conceptual frameworks are brought together? What's the nature of this sort of stereoscopic fusion of the manifest and the scientific image, which is supposed to harmonize the irreducibly normative nature of persons with the ultimately physical nature of the universe, including persons? Now, Sellars pushes his scientific realism so strongly that it's often difficult to see how the manifest image survives and how persons and norms end up being something that have a role to play within the final scientific image of the world. And I think Bill DeVries emphasizes better than anyone, it's one of the best things I think written on this, how even in the final scientific image of the world as Sellars imagines it, we're not only going to have persons, we're going to have science as a value-laden activity. We're going to have all kinds of objects having instrumentality like hammers and so on, and we're going to have projects, all of which Bill has a nice discussion of, Bill DeVries in his book Wilfrid Sellars, in terms of what he calls the practical reality that's involved in the final synoptic vision. And I think that's a very insightful treatment. So the puzzle I'm going to deal now with something Bill talks about doesn't necessarily run against a lot of the insightful thing Bill wants to say in that final chapter, but I think it helps sort out how the two images are ultimately related in Sellars' mind. Okay. So here's Bill DeVries finds a tension in Sellars' account of how the objects of the two images, the scientific image, the ideal scientific image, and the manifest image, are supposed to be related to one another, a tension that I think can be avoided through a proper recognition of the central role of just this account of conceptual change that we've been teasing out. So DeVries gives a very clear account of this tension in the following passage, which concerns Sellars' article, Theoretical Explanation. And Bill has some ideas in the footnotes to his book that this might not be an article that's consistent with the rest of what Sellars thinks. And I'm trying to give a way of saying that it is consistent in the end. So DeVries begins by correctly pointing out that Sellars attempts to invert the traditional logical empiricist conception of correspondence rules where you define theoreticals in terms of observables. And there's a sense in which Sellars is defining observables ideally in terms of theoreticals. And here's the quote from Bill, quote number 11. Instead, Sellars proposes to turn the tables and treat substantive correspondence rules as proposals for redefinitions of observation vocabulary, and then I add in complex theoretical terms. Given his own definitions in this article, that is theoretical explanation, this would be a reduction on Sellars' view of observable objects to systems of theoretical objects, and Bill claims this conflicts with Sellars' official doctrine elsewhere, for there's a difference between reducing observable objects to aggregates or systems of theoretical objects, the difference between reduction and treating them as phenomenal appearances of the world, of the real. So the difference between reducing manifest objects to theoretical objects and saying that manifest objects are appearances of an ultimate theoretical reality. And Bill continues, the tension between the reductivism Sellars evinces in theoretical explanation and the Kantian phenomenalism of other works can be summarized this way. Sellars explicates the reduction relation as an identity relationship, and identity relationships are equivalence relationships with all that entails, including symmetry and transitivity. But the appearance-reality relationship is supposed to be asymmetrical. It is not a form of identity. Sellars, therefore, cannot consistently characterize the relation between the ultimate scientific framework and the manifest image as both a reduction and a form of the relation between the manifest phenomenal and the scientifically real. So there's an important tension, I think, that Bill says is at the heart of this. And I think Bill thinks, from his book, it seems we can sidestep that in when Sellars is, we don't need to take that account in theoretical explanation, I guess, as Sellars, something that's in the rest of Sellars' philosophy. So I try to work that out now in terms of this view of abstract change. So looking at 12 and 13, Sellars wants to assert not only the appearance thesis in 12, but also, at least in that article, theoretical explanation, the reductive identity thesis in 13. So Sellars wants to hold 12. Manifest objects are appearances to human minds of a reality which is constituted by systems of imperceptible particles. So that's from Philosophy and the Scientific Image of Man, and that's this general Kantian picture that Sellars has. But he also wants to hold 13. Manifest objects are identical with, reducible to, systems of theoretical objects. And De Vries suggests that, look, the appearance claim and the identity claim are incompatible. And it's obviously a good objection, since they have a different logic, appearance being asymmetrical and identity being symmetrical. Now, I think if we look at the account of conceptual change that Sellars offers, that's the way to understand this tension, and that the tension's only apparent. And I do think for wider reasons this is important for understanding at least how, whether one is interested in Sellars' stereoscopic fusion or not. McDowell, I know, is not interested in that sort of thing. But this is important, I think, for understanding Sellars' views on how they relate, and that's what I'll try to show now. So to see this, first let's go back to the case of scientific theory change, and then I'll apply it to the case of the manifest image of the world and how it relates to the scientific image of the world, and show how Sellars wants to maintain both 12 and 13. So with respect to the appearance claim 12, we've seen that there's one sense in which, from the perspective of Einsteinian theory, the world of Newtonian masses is a world of mere appearances. However, on Sellars' account, this is shown precisely by means of this successful identification by reconceptualization of Newtonian dot quote mass in terms of the demonstrably more accurate functional counterpart concept in Einstein's theory. So there's one sense in which you can say there's enough generic functional similarity that we can say that Newtonian dot quote masses are what Einsteinian dot quote masses turned out to be. That's what mass really is. They're both mass concepts. Mass turns out to really be Einsteinian mass. there is no such thing as Newtonian mass. And Newtonian, well, we're also going to be able to explain now that there's sufficient generic similarity between those two mass concepts for us to make the charitable claim that the relativistic concept of mass is what Newtonian mass turned out to be an approximation toward. And that has some specific meat if the idea of making context-relative functional judgments of functional similarity makes sense at all. We can say that Newtonian .quote mass was doing a job that, strictly speaking, turned out to be false from the later perspective, but is in certain generic respects identifiable with what the later concept is. So Sellars' discussion of these matters in science and metaphysics, if you've worked through them, it's not easy to get my. I was thinking when I was reading, I was thinking to myself that he had no deference to the reader, and I was thinking there's a kind of deferential opacity in that whole book that there's. He writes in a way that now isn't it apparently that John McDowell was the one student that sat through those lectures, the John Locke lectures when they were initially given. Okay, so I think what I want to hold is 14 through 16, which I think it's sometimes hard to keep exactly from which perspective certain claims are being made about which propositions considered relative to which frameworks, but this is what Sellars wants to hold. 14, proposition P, incorporating Newtonian .quote masses that are true, i.e. correctly semantically assertable from within the Newtonian perspective, are strictly speaking false when considered in this same Newtonian role, but from the Einsteinian perspective. So if you consider the Newtonian concept of mass playing its Newtonian role from the Einsteinian perspective, then it's strictly speaking false. There's no such thing in the world as Newtonian masses. The world conceived from the Newtonian perspective has turned out to be a world of mere appearances. So this stresses the specific differences between the Newtonian concept of mass and the Einsteinian concept of mass. But 15, nonetheless, quote 15, it's not a quote, this is me. Nonetheless, from the Einsteinian perspective, there's sufficient generic functional similarity between the role of propositions P involving Newtonian mass and their successor counterparts in Einstein as both concepts of mass that we can, in another sense, identify Newtonian mass with its reconceived Einsteinian successor concept. There really exists only Einsteinian mass, which is what Newtonian mass has turned out to be. So this is that reductive identification by reconceptualization. So I think that's what Sellars wants to do, that kind of property identification across conceptual frameworks. He wants to, if you can have both the appearance claim and the identity claim, as long as you understand what's going on in conceptual change across those frameworks. Or so I think, anyway. Now, on that wider issue of transcendental idealism, there's a sense in which Sellars regards the manifest image as transcendentally ideal. It seems to me, I might be wrong about this, to be an essential feature of Sellars' philosophy that some framework gets shown to be transcendentally ideal only by being shown to be more adequately accounted for in a successor framework that explains why the predecessor framework is a system of appearances. Sellars actually thinks Kant's arguments for transcendental idealism are unsound. He says if you're into Kant, there's an interesting thing in Science and Metaphysics, Chapter 2, where Sellars says that Kant's own arguments for transcendental idealism commit certain modal fallacies. And if you're familiar with Paul Guyer and the error that he thinks Kant makes, a certain modal fallacy, it has to do with whether it's necessarily true that space is Euclidean, or whether space is necessarily Euclidean. And Paul Guyer says that Kant's argument for the transcendental ideality of geometry involves that modal fallacy. And Sellars thinks a similar thing, I think that. So the way that something gets shown for Sellars to be a transcendentally ideal framework is only if it's successfully shown to be an inadequate framework relative to a more adequate successor framework. So I think that's true. I might be wrong about that. Okay. And note, incidentally, that in Chapter 6 of that Science and Metaphysics, Sellars states that if it did turn out that a Straussonian picture of the world were adequate, a neo-Aristotelian Straussonian view of the world, then that would be the correct conceptual framework, and it would adequately picture reality. Picturing isn't for Sellars related only to the scientific image. It happens to be. I think Sellars' scientific realism is a contingent thesis. It happens to be the case that we've learned that there are more adequate conceptual frameworks, and that relegates the other conceptual frameworks to mere appearances. Okay. So finally, I think we can apply that framework specifically then to the relationship between the two, the manifest image and the scientific image. And so roughly speaking, for Sellars, colors and other sensible qualities, some of you know this view of his, they're ultimately reconceived as states of the perceiver in some sense, and ultimately sensa as certain absolute processes in central nervous systems of animals. So I think this following passage in 17 explains how Sellars thinks of the relationship between the two images, and so I claim that the account I've been given makes sense of what is otherwise a kind of obscure passage in Sellars. So here in 17, Sellars is suggesting that the idea of Kantian phenomenal appearances, that's what Sellars uses to emphasize the specific differences between different functional roles of different concepts. And when he talks about survival by reductive identification, that's when he's emphasizing the generic similarity across conceptual frameworks. And I think he does that in this passage. So, quote 17, to what extent does the positive account, Sellars says, I've been giving amount to a Kantian-type phenomenalism? Should I say that the essay of the common sense world is conkipi? Well, that's not too misleading to do, provided that this is taken to be a vigorous way of stressing the radical differences in conceptual structure between the framework of common sense and the developing framework of science. It's just interesting that he's clearly analyzing the relationship between the two images in terms of this specific account of generic similarity and specific difference of functional role concepts. And even those judgments are going to be context-relative and purpose-relative judgments of functional similarity. Yet, he continues, according to the picture I've been sketching, the concepts in terms of which the objects of the common sense or manifest image are identified have successor concepts in the scientific image, and correspondingly the individual concepts of the manifest image have counterparts in the scientific image, which, however different in logical structure, can legitimately be regarded as their successors. So in this sense, emphasizing these similarities, which is not available to Kant about his things in themselves, the objects of the manifest image do really exist. That is, insofar as they're identified with their successors. So I think this overall set of distinctions, which it took me a long time to try to clarify, because Sellars' discussion I find difficult, but I think that helps to make sense of at least what his view of those synoptic relations are. But I can recommend the final chapter of Bill's book, though, as once this is in place, I think the issues he's discussing at the end of his book are the things that we need to grapple with. Okay, so that's, the paper's the central importance of Sellars' theory of conceptual change. It's sort of centrally important for Sellars junkies in one sense. I think it makes sense of the synoptic vision of the two images and how they're related. This one now in section 4 is a little more general, and I'm a little more vague about it, but I'm going to use some of this to grapple with some things in John McDowell. Okay, so here I want to develop a tension of my own and see it in John McDowell's mind and world, and I'm sure he disabused me of that idea that there's a tension of this kind, but let's see how it goes. So let's separate the issue of conceptual change from specifically scientific conceptual change. And that allows McDowell and Sellars to talk to one another, because McDowell is not interested in the sorts of things that Sellars' scientific realism wants to do. I want to talk more about mind, meaning, and knowledge across conceptual frameworks in general. And since Mind and World, I don't know whether this is something McDowell's come increasingly to recognize, but he's certainly increasingly writing about the differences between his views and Sellars' views, because they are radically striking differences. I mean, I guess I'd be more sympathetic with Bob's take on a lot of things in Sellars, to the extent that if you emphasize, Sellars holds that truth, knowledge, meaning, all of these things are not basic relations to the world. And for McDowell, they are. And that's got to be a huge difference. And I think it shows up in this account of direct openness to the world that's in Mind and World. Sellars, McDowell has a nice article in his new book on Sellars' Thomism, where he's emphasizing how important it is for Sellars that intentionality isn't a relation to a basic relation to the world, and McDowell tries to diagnose that as part of Sellars' scientism. Now, Sellars' view is that meaning and intentionality are essentially normative classificatory idioms, as we know. Meaning statements normatively, functionally classify the entry, inference, and exit roles played by various linguistic tokens in various rule-governed conceptual frameworks. And so that rots in German are dot quote reds. That entails that they're used regularly in response to red objects, and that they're evoked systematically by red objects. And I think Bob Branham has some good things on this and this presupposition relationship and making it explicit. But the intentional relation or the meaning relation itself isn't a relation to the world, isn't a basic normative relation to the world. And it's a deep and broadly Platonic mistake on Sellars' views to take meaning and other intentional phenomena to be basic relations. And that's one of the big differences between Sellars' nominalistic naturalism and what McDowell calls his naturalized Platonism. So against that whole background, let's look at Mind and World's notion of a direct openness to the world. For McDowell, Sellars' rejection of the myth of the given is a good thing because it helps us to retain a plausible view of empirical knowledge while avoiding the implausible poles of appeals to the given, the non-conceptual given in particular, and mere frictionless internal coherence. McDowell correctly emphasizes that if our perceptual experiences are to be a source of empirically justified claims about the world, and now here's how McDowell puts it, then our passive sensory experiences of objects must themselves already be informed by the sorts of conceptual capacities that make normative justification possible within the logical space of reasons. So here's McDowell, passage 18. Quote, the thinkable contents that are ultimate in the order of justification are contents of experiences, and in enjoying an experience, one is open to manifest facts that obtain anyway and impress themselves on one's sensibility. At any rate, one seems to be open to facts, and when one is not misled, according to McDowell, one is. That's a familiar phrase McDowell uses over and over. When we're not misled, at least, then we're open to the fact, directly open to the facts in the world. He's modified his view more recently. Maybe it's not facts. We're open to the layout of the environment in a certain way. I'm not going to get on him for facts. Everyone knows that works on Sellars and McDowell that facts are items in the linguistic order for Sellars. Bill DeVries actually emphasizes this very well in his book. So it's clear that they're going to have different views of facts, but I don't want to focus on that. I want to focus on certain other important differences. So McDowell says, to paraphrase Wittgenstein, when we see that such and such is the case, we and our seeing do not stop anywhere short of the fact. What we see is that such and such is the case, unquote. So this conception of a direct openness to the layout of objects in the world, as they are in themselves, has obvious philosophical attractions. In McDowell, this direct realism has to go with a disjunctivist view of perceptual experience. It's clear to me, I think it's clear, that Sellars would reject the disjunctivist view that McDowell defends. But I don't want to get into that issue either. If I had to choose between Sellars' mad dog qualia realism and McDowell's disjunctivism, I wouldn't want to have to make that choice. I mean, I'd like a view in between. So I'm not focusing on that particular issue. I'm focusing on the more general sense of being misled, if McDowell would use that phrase, the sense in which conceptual changes in worldview are involved in our ongoing epistemic adjustments to reality. unlike the case of qualia, there's enough in common between Sellars and McDowell here to make it at least interesting to compare them. Now, I think, I expect this is true, that most philosophers who were really familiar with Sellars before they'd read Mind and World, it's a compelling account in Mind and World, but if you were a Sellarsian coming to that book in the first place, which isn't normally the case among British philosophers, for instance, they're usually coming at Sellars after McDowell. But in passage 18 that we just looked at, I think if you were a Sellarsian before coming to Mind and World, this idea of, quote, enjoying an experience, one is open to manifest facts that obtain anyway and impress themselves on one's sensibility, this would have looked like an instance of the myth of the given rather than a rejection of it. Now, I know from McDowell there's why he thinks it isn't, and we'll see that now. McDowell himself is well aware that Sellars' myth of the given comes not only in the form of non-conceptual givens, but in the form of any alleged direct awareness of facts. But McDowell would respond to the worry I've just raised by saying it entirely overlooks the role that, on his view, our conceptual capacities play within exercises of human sensory receptivity. The receptive contents in passage 18 from McDowell are thinkable contents on his view, precisely because of the role played by our acquired conceptual capacities in enabling us to take in such factual shapings of sensory consciousness, which Bill DeVries is going to talk about in the first place. So McDowell, like Bob Brandom, stresses this anti-atomist point against the given, that the conceptual capacities that are thus involved in passive sensory impressions, on his view, would not be the capacities that they are unless they were also exercised in various kinds of active judging within the wider conceptual worldview of a space of reasons. So for at least these reasons, McDowell takes his conception that the world impresses its facts directly upon us in sensory consciousness involves a rejection of the myth of the given rather than being an instance of it. And it has another virtue of accounting for a kind of direct experiential openness to the world without any intermediaries or gaps that he thinks is threatened by both Sellars' view of non-conceptual sensory impressions, and he thinks is threatened, I think, by Bob Brandom's account of Sellars' inferentialism. I think that McDowell thinks this insufficiently gets us in grip, in direct contact with the world in our judgments. Okay. But can we say from McDowell then, and now's where I'm just attempting to raise attention in McDowell related to the problem of conceptual change, can we say that when we're not misled by illusions or hallucinations, when the conditions of perception are favorable and we've been rationally responsible, that in these are instances of the world impressing its facts on our sensibility? And obviously not quite, since McDowell recognizes that it would be arrogant to assume that the particular wider conceptual framework that informs any given historical period or individual sensory receptivity is unassailable. That is, well, let me just read then quote 19 from McDowell. That's what I want to focus on. How are we doing? Do I have about 5-10 minutes left? Yeah. McDowell, quote 19, the conceptual capacities that are passively drawn into play in experience belong to a network of capacities for active thought. The network, as an individual thinker finds it, and he elsewhere says a given historical period or culture governing her thinking is not sacrosanct. Active empirical thinking takes place under a standing obligation to reflect about the credentials of the putatively rational linkages that govern it. There must be a standard willingness to refashion concepts, it's conceptual change, and conceptions if that is what reflection recommends. No doubt there is no serious prospect, why is there no serious prospect, that we might need to reshape the concepts at the outermost edges of the system, the most immediately observational concepts, in response to pressures from inside the system. But that no doubt unreal prospect brings out the point that matters for my present purposes. This is that although experience itself is not a good fit for the idea of spontaneity, even the most immediately observational concepts are partly constituted by their role in something that is indeed appropriately conceived in terms of spontaneity. So, I mean, I don't know, I could be wrong about this, but presumably it seems to me what we can say about the sensory impressions that directly open up the structure of reality to us for McDowell is something along line 20. This is me, not McDowell. If we can assume the adequacy or accuracy in relevant respects of the particular conceptual framework or linguistic tradition in terms of which we acquire the conceptual capacities that inform our sensory impressions of the world, that give them that shape, then we can say, quote from McDowell, in a particular experience in which one is not misled by illusions, what one takes in is that things are thus and so, where the latter is an aspect of the layout of the world. It is how things are, unquote. So it's, since in the previous passage, 19, McDowell has assured us, quote, that there's no serious prospect that we might need to reshape our most immediately observational concepts, then we can presumably have confidence that at least our basic observational responses to the world, such as this is red, are cases in which the world's facts impress themselves on our sensibility. But I think, once this issue of conceptual change and fallibility and improvement is kept in the foreground, then the question of a direct sensory openness to the objects in the world, it takes on an entirely different hue if we keep that at the front of our attention. Notice, I think, that on Sellars' own or Brandam's own inferentialist or functional role semantics, and for that matter, Sellars' sort of pictorial view that Ode was talking about of basic matter-of-factual judgments, but the inferentialist in any way, can fully support the directly realist claim that's embodied in 20. That is to say, to the extent that we might be justified for whatever reason, I'll just speak of Sellars, in assuming that our perceptual language entry responses are structured by a conceptual framework that is in fact empirically adequate in relevant respects, then to that extent for Sellars, our perceptual judgments that things are thus and so will directly represent and be true of an independent world in which things are thus and so. It might be configurations of objects rather than facts as basic. But if you can be confident that you're in a conceptual framework that's adequate in relevant respects, then it will be the case that basic matter-factual judgments on the inferentialist account too will say that things are thus and so, and when things are thus and so in the environment. So if 20 is what McDowell is forced to say, the inferentialist can say 22. Sellars has no problem saying that. So I think really many of the most important differences between Sellars and McDowell stem from the significances that they attach to conceptual change, other than to which usually doesn't get discussed so much in that context. Because they can both assert direct openness to the world. What matters is the confidence that we're in a conceptual framework that's adequate in relevant respects. So consider the judgment that this apple in front of me is red. Is there any serious prospect, to use McDowell's phrase, that we shall need to refashion the observational concepts such as that embodied in that judgment? Well, on Sellars' account, we know there is an intelligible sense for Sellars in which we won't. It's not likely that it will turn out true that there are red apples and that there are chairs. We saw that before. Sellars wants to say there's a sense in which our ordinary concepts are true because they survive in their counterparts in the science. There's enough generic similarity for it to turn out true even in the final image, in that sense, that there are red apples and so on. So in that sense, though, but we've also seen that there's another sense on Sellars' view where inquiry is supposed to force us to recognize that the conceptual structure in which our manifest perceptual judgments come is not ultimately adequate, and in that sense the world's facts do not impress themselves on our sensory receptivity in its current shape. Whatever one thinks of Sellars' particular views on color, the more general account of conceptual change on which it depends no more introduces the sort of objectionable gap between thought and reality or experience and reality that McDowell's worried about than does the understated implication of McDowell's own view in 20 above, if I'm right that is an implication of McDowell's own view. Direct openness to the structure of reality is a virtue that's reserved for experiences that are informed by conceptual capacities that have the right shape. For McDowell, that thought is supposed to relieve us of the sorts of philosophical worries about bridging the gap between mind and world that have plagued modern philosophers since the rise of science, through a diagnosis of the subtle philosophical errors that have threatened to dislodge us from a world in which we're already largely at home, I think, for McDowell. It seems to be a premise of his account. Whereas for Sellars, that same thought, the thought captured in 20, that if we have a scheme that's adequate in relevant respects, we're directly open to the layout of things in the world, that same thought for Sellars inspires a view of modern science and philosophy as reflective practices in which language has become self-consciously militant, as he puts it in one place, as embodying our attempts to radically refashion concepts that might more adequately represent a reality that has proved to have a very different conceptual shape from the one in which we thought we were at home. Now, you don't have to just apply this to Sellars' radical account of how color is supposedly going to end up being relocated to the perceiver. I think if the phenomena of conceptual change are emphasized, then you get an entirely different picture of openness to reality, and the virtues that it had can be had by the inferentialist as much as by McDowell, and the inferentialist arguably doesn't have certain mysteries involving primitive intentional relations that McDowell has, arguably. Okay. So, to return finally to the myth of the given, I'll finish up here now very, very shortly. It's not only in empirical science, but in philosophy more general that Sellars thinks. So I think it's important in that it doesn't. The topic of conceptual change isn't usually at the center of attention in talking about mind and world, but I think it's absolutely crucial from Sellars' perspective. And when Sellars discusses the myth of the given, I think conceptual change is at the front of his mind. So Sellars in the Caris lectures reformulated the myth of the given in terms of 21. This line of thought, Sellars says in 21, involves the principle, quote, if a person is directly aware of an item which has categorical status C, then the person is aware of it as having categorical status C. This principle, Sellars says, is perhaps the most basic form of what I have castigated as the myth of the given. To reject the myth of the given is to reject the idea that the categorical structure of the world. Now, this isn't an atomist view, I don't think. Anti-atomism is crucial to rejecting the given, but I don't think it's the only form in which givenness can take place. I think there can be non-atomistic views infected by the given. I mean, Sellars says Hegel was infected with the given, and why is it? It's not because Hegel was an atomist. I think it has something to do with that the categorical structure is sort of where our home will be with the shape that it has necessarily, independent of the vagaries of contingent inquiry and conceptual change. I know Hegel has conceptual change, but it has a necessary structure form. And that, I think, I go into some things here that I think I'll skip now and I'll just finish up. But I mean, what Sellars is talking about when he talks about, it's a very odd view to say that the fundamental form of the myth of the given in that quote is that a person is directly aware of an item which has categorical status C, that the person is aware of it as having categorical status C, because who's aware of the categorical classifications that their experiences fall under, right? So it seems an odd thing to say that the perceiver, the myth of the given is that people are directly aware of the items they experience as having categorical metaphysical statuses of various kinds. But I don't think that's what Sellars is saying. When he's talking there, he's arguing against Roderick Firth and C.I. Lewis, saying that in direct awareness, we're aware in most basic form of things that have come under the category of the mental. We're directly aware of things that are experiences. Sellars wants to defend the view that we're directly aware of things that are physical objects. And Sellars' point really is, look, the conceptual classification that's appropriate to what it is that someone's directly experiencing isn't something that's given just in the direct experience of it. And it's philosophers that think just in virtue of being directly experienced in a certain way, that thing must have a certain categorical structure, must be a thing of a certain kind. And that's why I think he's right to sort of say it's a fundamental, it's perhaps the myth of the given in its most fundamental form. And what I think with McDowell is the tension is that I keep landing in a dilemma with McDowell. If I can rest complacently with the categorical structure of things that inform my sensory experiences, then I can see that I'm directly open to the world. But if I stress conceptual change, which McDowell also has to stress and does stress within mind and world, then I only get number 16, confidence in the openness of the world. To the extent that I can assume that I've already got a conceptual adequate framework, then I'm directly open to the world. If he doesn't stress, so if he stresses conceptual change, you only get what the Sellarsian inferentialist gets anyway. It's better to have that because it involves no basic normative relations to the world. If he doesn't stress it, then you get direct openness to the world, but only in an unjustified confidence that the categorical structure of the world imposes itself on us like it's holistic, but it's imposing itself on us like, even though it's acquired, it doesn't have the kind of status that Sellars thinks conceptual frameworks have when they're subject to conceptual change. So those were the two tensions I was interested in discussing. Thanks.
Je remercie James O'Shea pour son exposé. La discussion est ouverte. Qui demande la parole? Please, Michael Williams.
This is not a very focused question. I've not had a focus, partly because these are things I don't think I fully understand. So, you have these interesting things to say, which I've been getting into a bit myself, about conceptual change in Sellars, and you say it comes out most clearly in the case of successor concepts and scientific theories. But then it illuminates the clash of the images somehow.
Yeah.
And that's what I wonder about, whether that's really so, because, I mean, the sort of thing that leads Bill to say that, here's question one, okay?
Yeah.
The sort of thing that leads Bill to say that ordinary objects have practical reality,
Right.
is that they don't have successor concepts in the scientific image. I mean, there's no successor concept to chair. I mean, no doubt when we talk about chairs, we are, in any given instance, talking about things that we could, as it were, delineate within the scientific way of thinking about physical objects. I mean, there'll be some kind of discontinuity in the electromagnetic field at the boundary of the chair, I suppose. But chairs, as Heidegger tells us, are sitting in, right? I mean, they're not, they're not, as it were, mere. You're already talking about things that are merely present to hand, to speak Heideggerese, when you've moved into the scientific image. So everything that we think of in terms of practical reality has been left behind, at least as a fundamental concept, because they're all personal, relative in certain ways. And the concept of a person is, as a categorially irreducible concept, is precisely what's, by definition, missing from the scientific image. So there's...
I think exactly what you're saying is what Bill's final chapter is good about, because so
I'm worried about how your model applies.
Right.
It looks as if all the concepts. So that was question one. Question two is this: do you really think the issue of the clash of the images, and do you think Sellars is consistent about this, is the same as the issue of common sense objects versus scientifically conceived objects, or commonsensically conceived objects? Are they the same issue? Because
okay, well that might be related to your first question,
It is related, because sometimes you see, in the quote you give here, that seems to be what he's saying. But sometimes he says the images are not actually common sense versus science, that they're both, as it were, highly theorized philosophical worldviews. One abstracted from common sense and one abstracted.
Sure.
But neither the common sense thinker nor the theoretical physicist is automatically bound up with either the manifest or the scientific image. It's actually the philosophical tradition.
Yeah, and on that second question, if you're taking it that route, that's true, that they're philosophically idealized frameworks. But I don't think that's good. Let me deal with your first question, which I was more...
I think they're related questions, actually.
Yeah. I mean, what Bill does, which I think is good and right, and is going to be tough for anyone to struggle with, and Bill does it better than anyone I've read on this particular topic. You're going to have hammers and chairs and so on. So now, what Sellars' language he uses, and Bill picks up on it, I think, is there's this, if you like, the formal cause at one time, the formal normative functional aspects of things, as opposed to the material realism. So let's just take his functional role semantics about thoughts. Sellars clearly isn't a Churchland in many, I think, in many, he's not an eliminativist, and so thoughts are going to be preserved. Persons are going to be in the scientific image insofar as intending beings are going to be in the scientific image. What's going to be is that anything that's characterized with regard to its objective features in some sense. So the table as a chunk of proper and common sensibles. There, Sellars thinks, let's call that the sort of, blankly object categorization of the thing. Those concepts will be replaced by successive concepts. And so we're going to move around the world intending, responding, doing science. But in that sense, the content, as Sellars puts it, of the material content of our judgments will be about scientifically conceived objects directly. The language entry, it's hard to picture this, but the language, it'll be a Feyerabindian language entry responses to there's a nice swarm of particles and so on. But there will still be, with regard to anything that's normative, I don't think Sellars is always clear on this, what you do with the special sciences, what you do with biology, what you do with, he says the laws aren't reducible, but the entities. Chemical objects just are configurations of the sorts of objects described by physics. Yeah, but what about chemical laws, and what about chemical kinds? I don't think Sellars was as sophisticated as his discussions come at that point. Subsequently to that, that's one of the big issues now. But I think what he thinks is there's an intelligible sense in which tables, as we conceive them in sophisticated common sense, don't exist as they're conceived by sophisticated common sense with regard to their Eddington two tables like smoothness and objectively colored features. They have a successor concept that says Williams responding to the world mistakenly judges that color is a feature of the object when it's really, there's a kind of error theory, Pritchard's perception rests on a mistake. The scientifically true counterpart of the judgment about the table as an object will involve states of yourself in a way that it doesn't. But you can say it was always true to say that the table's red because it has that relevantly similar successor concept. So when Bill's handling the tough things that he calls the practical reality in a very interesting way that relates to Kant, he's addressing those things that involve the functional uses of things that have normative elements that involve practical engagement with the world, to the extent that Bill thinks substance concepts of the the material content of the objects has to be preserved. There, I think we might disagree. My Sellarsian final enders are more Feyerabindian. The manifest image survives if we've got persons. Persons is the fundamental thing that survives in the manifest image. But the content of our perceptual judgments and the things that we handle in one respect will be replaced by scientific concepts. In another respect, that they involve tools and certain normative functional. Whether this picture can hang together, I'm not sure. But that's the way I see it.
What you're really saying is that the successor concepts are not going to be the table. They're going to be the color of the table, the smoothness of the table, the hardness of the table. Those will have successor concepts.
The concept of the table...
The table's not going to have a success. I mean, see, that's what's worrying me. If you insist on successor concepts, it looks as if you've got to demand more than token identity. And it doesn't seem to me you've got to get more than token identity, because a system of particles is going to be the material realization of table in very specific instances. But table itself is an irreducibly functional category. So it's not relating to persons.
Right.
So there's going to be no counter. There's going to be no successor counterpart.
It may be that the problem.
Unless you're going to get colour of the table, smoothness, hardness, the physical properties of the table. Sure, there'll be successor concepts, but table there will be no successor.
I think there's going to be in things that some of the things I've been listening to from Sellars on CDs, his lectures from Notre Dame. You get these things. He breaks the concept down in two so that it's true. You can talk about the table qua thing ready to hand or present to hand and involving instrumentality and so on. You can talk, on the other hand, about its proper and common sensibles, and that can be constitutive of certain aspects of our common sense concept of a table. So that you can say that its problem will break into perhaps two different kinds of things there.
It isn't, though, because tables can be made of plastic, wood, steel, one leg, four legs. I mean, come on.
Well, in that sense,
it's just not going to happen.
And Sellars thinks it'll never happen that our concepts of thoughts could ever turn out not to be the thoughts. That there will be there are tables in a sense it can't turn out not to be true, and in a sense in which, just like with thoughts, since they're essentially the role players that they are, in one sense you can say that, let's do it with thoughts, in one sense you can say that the successor concept to thoughts will be a certain neurophysiological state that we ultimately identify them with, and you can make sense of saying that that's what thoughts turned out to be. But there's another sense in which it's only, and maybe this is what the question is, and Bill does this in his final chapter, with the later successor concept, we're not going to be intelligibly be able to relate that swarm of stuff at that level to the role that was played by thoughts or the role that was played by tables. So if you can't, that is, how are you going to, at the level of talking about, it's like a Putnam point about explaining why a square peg goes through the square hole and so on. How are you going to re-identify the ordinary concept of a table with this future scientifically described thing? Because nothing in that language will give you the relevant functional roles.
So you're going to say that it's consistent with, say, the not this applying the apparatus of successor concept to the class of the images is consistent, say, with agreeing with Davidson on the novelist monism? This just seems plausible. Maybe I'm just missing something. I mean, because a novelist monism gives you only token physical identity. That's the point of it.
I'm not sure how it agrees with that, because what Sellars is saying that thoughts do exist and will always exist because they're neat enough role players and so on. That Davidson doesn't have that.
But then they won't have any realizers that figure in any robustly counterfactual inferences in the language of physics or in the language of idealized neurophysiology or whatever. I mean, so.
I'm not sure that is necessarily the case. I mean, I think
that's the claim of anomalous monism.
Yeah.
And I mean,
I'm not sure that Sellars.
I'm worried that by applying this analogy between Newtonian and Einsteinian mass, you're setting yourself up for a closer fit between manifest objects and whatever their realizers are in the scientific image. Then you're going to get, I mean, because it looks as if you're going to want a tighter connection between than mere token identity, between the objects as functionally classified at the manifest level and as realized and described in the language of fundamental physics or whatever in the scientific. It looks as if, it looks as if to me you're looking for something that Sellars couldn't possibly imagine. Well, if he did, he was wrong.
But why, I mean...
Anyway, I won't question it.
Well, I think it's kind of a crucial question, and I don't know that I have a snappy answer on it, but there seems to be, in one respect, he wants to see you cross over these frameworks, but he does want to say that these manifest concepts are identifiable with their success. We saw him say it, and he wants to say that the apple is red is then identifiable with the successor concept. And you don't have any problem with that with regard to physical magnitudes and so on as conceived within the common sense world, that they might be conceived to have color as an intrinsic feature in ways that could be intelligibly related on this story, if we're taking this to be sympathetic with this at all. that they're identifiable with their scientific successors, where color gets displaced and so on. You don't have any problem with that per se. But it's with tables and with anything that's functionally defined.
Well, because you see...
And there I'm just wondering, why does it... I don't quite see why it ends up with anomalous monism, because there is where I think Bill's story is correct. That when you...
Look, it depends what you think. Here's where the second issue might come up. You might think that the manifest image is not common sense objects as common sense that you could see, which is functional through and through, and they don't need success. They don't need successors. You might think that the manifest image is already a certain theorization of common sense objects, where we've already abstracted out certain of their features as categorical. Intrinsic color would be, and then if you take that line, then it's only those features of them that have been already highlighted in the manifest image that would need successor concepts in the scientific image. And then all the stuff that was practical could, as Sellars says, be joined to the science. I mean, he says that in SIM. It could be joined to the scientific image, but it wouldn't need to be identified with elements in the scientific image through the apparatus of successor concepts. So it really matters what you
when you say all the stuff could be joined, it's just what I remain sort of unclear about myself is what all the stuff is. There's something.
Anything with the practical in it, according to philosophy and the scientific image of man. So there is this fundamental dualism that remains in Sellars between the dimension of describing and explaining and the dimension of deciding, intending, and all that. And ordinary functional classifications of objects would actually be fully in the practical dimension, which needs to be. And
it might
well be that vocabulary itself could then be modified through osmosis, because the scientific ways of thinking could leach into our practical decisions. But it's only in the dimension of describing and explaining that we need the apparatus of successor concepts. And so you wouldn't need all common sense concepts to have successor concepts in the scientific image. Only such concepts as the manifest image had already extracted from ordinary ways of thinking and given a special status in the dimension of describing and explaining would need successor concepts. That wouldn't mean then that ordinary ways of thinking about objects had to have scientific successors.
On that last thing, I do think the manifest image is sophisticated and already makes these Jonesian moves to some extent of talking about impressions as states of perceivers. But I do think there's aspects of the manifest image that is an ontology of physical objects that says that colors are constituent.
Yeah, and that's the only part that needs the successor concepts.
And that's fine.
Ordinary ways, but then on that view, you shouldn't identify the manifest image with ordinary ways of thinking about things. It's only with an aspect of ordinary ways about thinking of things that it's only an aspect that will cry out.
But I think both hammers and the sense in which
they don't need to go in. Hammers don't need to go in.
Right. Well, to the extent
physical constituents of hammers would need to go in, but hammers wouldn't need to go in.
Then the problem doesn't arise.
Exactly.
Well, then that's fine. I don't mind that.
That's why I was. Okay.
I think it's an interesting point to point out. Though I don't do this. Bill does this. How hammers, the practical reality involved in hammers, does need to survive. But I think there are certain things about the objects of the manifest image then that will be re-identified with their successor concepts and that explain why the manifest image is a realm of appearances and so on and so forth. But I think that the functionally related concepts go the same way as thoughts. That those are going to be related to the practical reality of persons. That ultimately is fine. I think that's good.
Another question? Yes?
I'd like to invert the former speaker's argument from the general table of the specific properties to the general properties to the specific particles. You were speaking during your talk of colorless particles.
Yeah.
The problem is in science is much more complex now, as you know, and there is a whole chromodynamics, just to speak of colors, introduced as elementary particles. So the problem is you change concepts, you don't change the objects. And apparently it doesn't pose any problem to scientific theory. So you treat colors up and down, you have charm in particles. So they are all new properties which serve to describe our scientific theories. So the problem of the general table and the successor properties can be inverted in this sense. What do you think about it?
So, along Davidson's line, in general, that was related. You could say that there are two ways of just describing the same object. You can describe color as a subatomic feature of quarks and so on, or you can describe color in ordinary terms. That's going to be, to some extent, just a substantive dispute between. Sellars, he attempts to argue for his view that the ontology of common sense. Now, whether he's right about this or not is an interesting question, but that there's a conflict between the conception of colors as features of objects as conceived in sophisticated common sense and whatever sense of color would be used. To say that they're just two descriptions of the same thing and that there's no problem, that it's just the same object, I think he just thinks that he can substantively argue against that. There's an analysis of what are. You could already do it with the common sense framework and say that qualia don't present a problem that he thinks they do present, because he's got a fairly strong analysis of. He thinks if some philosopher tries to tell me that the redness of the apple is just its disposition to cause certain things in me, that's just a mistaken phenomenological analysis of color as it features in the sophisticated common sense view of the world. So to some extent, it's the strength of that phenomenological analysis in the manifest image that sets up the conflict. And if you take on and reject some of that and just want to say, look, there's the world and it's got two descriptions that are useful, and it's the same object described two ways, there's the substantive disagreements have to take place at that level. Does that address it?
Yeah, I think so.
It's not entirely satisfactory.
Any other question?
I've got the microphone and I've got a question, so I'm in good position. In science and metaphysics, I don't remember exactly the paragraph, but Sellars explains that we can give sense to the idea of conceptual change, since we can imagine two games of chess, for example, which might be slightly different. And he asks when we are to decide that one game is different than another game. And so we may ask when a concept change of nature. So my question is, what would Sellars think about some concepts not change but mere disparitions? For example, that they extinct, actually. For example, the concept of phlogiston or ether, etc.
Yeah.
Because in the case of phlogiston, you could think that, but in a way, our contemporary concept of heat is in a way or another a successor of that of the phlogiston. Nevertheless, we consider that the concept of phlogiston is useless or merely false. So how would you explain that in a Sellars frame?
I think Bill brought up that case, or Mike was discussing that as well. It's interesting that Sellars on these CDs, not that the only CDs I listen to aren't Sellars, but it happens that I have these CDs from Notre Dame, but he was discussing what became his article on conceptual change. And he says at a certain point, what about phlogiston? And then he says, actually, out of his interest, I went back and read a lot of the early accounts of phlogiston. And Sellars, he kind of was joking around to the audience, but he says, of course phlogiston exists. It survived in these successor theories. So, but I think... what I think his view is that you can make certain judgments that could go either way. That is, you could say the relevant dissimilarity. It's not the case that all the concepts of predecessor theories are going to survive in the relevant successor theories. It's in the case, and he does actually, Mike, wrestle with ordinary concepts in that way. He says, look, it's at the end of chapter 5 in Science and Metaphysics. He says it's going to have a different logical structure from ordinary substance concepts and then something that's a plurality of basic logical subjects. How can I say that the one is really a successor of the other? Isn't it a So he struggles with these things. So there's going to be some cases where he wants to say there's no survival, that there's not sufficient generic. What you've got is elimination, and so on. Other cases he wants to say, and in that talk he was giving, he was half joking, and this audience was laughing, but I think he was saying, of course there's phlogiston. That is, of course, the projects are relevantly similar in certain highly generic respects having to do with explaining oxidation or whatever it is, that we might actually want to say, of course, there's no such thing as phlogiston as conceived within phlogiston theory from our perspective. But in another sense, the survival counterpart concept is generically relevantly similar enough to say this is what, when they were trying to get at phlogiston, it turned out really to be. So I think he thinks, as Mike was emphasizing about some of this, is he says they're context relative, they're purpose relative. Do you want to say oder if it was used only as an exclusive or in German? Is it an or? He wants to say that, look, there are certain projects of classification, there are relevant similarities and dissimilarities, and answers can come out in different. Now that may be too wishy-washy for I don't know whether it is or not, whether on issues about translation, similarity of meaning, and sameness of meaning, that this is a good view. But in a way, I think it was wise for him to be not decisive about criteria for settling those kind of questions.
Yeah. I guess I'm just a little bit, I think that I'm a little bit unsatisfied with your resolution of my the tension I was trying to point to. And part of it, I think, might be that we've got these two different notions. One is the sort of the strict logical notion of identity, where we've got a very precise formal definitions of it, etc. Yeah. And then we've got this notion of identification, which is not a strictly logical notion. It's a pragmatically rich one. We identify one thing with another or as another, and that's a little bit more loose. And I'm not, even though we may identify certain things, that doesn't mean necessarily that when push comes to shove, you're going to say they are identical in that strict sense, because you might identify.
I think Strawson's individuals, when you read through and you're careful about the difference between identification and identity, it gets very difficult, and there's all kinds of...
and I think some of that's involved here.
He wants the strict sense. When I talk about re-identification or identification of certain kinds of predecessor objects with the later objects, the analysis of that involves the strict notion of identity. I mean, what that article's theoretical explanation, that you kind of think it doesn't fit in, right, with the rest of the corpus?
Actually, I haven't. Yeah, it seems to me it doesn't.
Yeah.
He's the way I read it, at least, was that he's trying to respond to a set of considerations that he sort of squished his own theory a bit to try and accommodate the people he was responding to, and I don't think it was a fully successful.
I mean, when I read it, it did fit in with the way that I read the rest of his stuff. That's why I was interested. I didn't see any jarring conflict. But what he does do is some fairly quick, hard moves. I mean, he sort of says, when he's talking about property identification of manifest phenomenal qualities, say, and at certain points he says, look, there's a problem about how to relate the observable realm to the theoretical realm. And at a certain point he says, we can solve that problem. Just identify the property. Just say that the observable qualitative property is
these swarms of colorless thing, and that looks draconian.
Yeah.
But then I think if you fit it into this other context, and you see that what he's doing is saying, I can still have the earlier. I think he does hold that the manifest image is approximately true, but strictly speaking false, right? So that when you get the later story, it looks draconian when you say, I'll solve the problem of redness. Redness just is identical with these scientifically conceived objects. But when the full story's in, you tell the history of the concepts that it emerged out of, and therefore you can say... by the way, he still needs sensings as preserving colors. So for him, he's such a strong realist about the qualia. You don't really get rid of them, but you reconceive what they are. So I agree there's this really harsh, strict identity of properties across the change. But what this Kevin Sharp's article is interesting about, and I think if you look at Sellars on induction at the end of SRL, Some Reflections on Language Games, Sellars is very interested in this whole thing of property identification across conceptual changes, but the notion in which the predecessor concept is identified with the later concept, in one sense, is strict identity. It's replacement. But in another sense, you can preserve, if you look back, the sense in which where it came from it shows that the earlier ones were mere appearances.
Bien, je crois que nous allons devoir mettre fin à la discussion et je remercie à nouveau en votre nom James Oshie pour sa conférence. Merci vraiment.